it was very literally like the face of the neighborhood changing. And there's a lot of gentrification happening in that area, especially with actually Columbia buying up a lot of buildings. And so the kind of diversity that gave so much community and culture to the neighborhood started to go away, right? And rent prices started to go up, and you started to see folks getting evicted, buildings changing significantly from what were previously older affordable buildings to now like luxury high rises. And it was sort of never something that I was really understanding what that change meant until I came back after college and started to understand what the real process of gentrification looked like and what the harms were, and when that sort of steamroller rolls through a neighborhood, what happens, right? What are all of the
where do those people
consequences
go?
that are felt? Exactly. What are all the consequences that are felt by these longstanding residents in neighborhoods across New York City? So that ended up being, a bit of a part of the motivation behind getting involved and starting JustFix.NYC.
Welcome to the Phil with Forbes 30 podcast. This is Phil Michaels, Forbes 30 Under 30 entrepreneur and performance coach. Every year, Forbes names the top 30 entrepreneurs, leaders, and stars in the world. And each week, I bring you one of them to help you level up in your life and business. From celebrities like LeBron James to Kylie Jenner and Cardi B, to entrepreneurs with companies like DoorDash, Instagram, and YouTube, you're sure to learn from the list. Thanks for spending time with me today. Now it's time to level up. Level up.
Welcome to Phil with Forbes 30 podcast. Today we have a very special guest. He made the Forbes USA list in 2018 for the law and policy category. He's a co-founder of JustFix.NYC, a nonprofit website that helps New York City renters fight evictions, request repairs, get your apartment's rent history, and even take your landlord to court. They won the Justice Innovation of the Year Award from the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law. He's a Cheng Fellow and Kennedy Fellow with a Master's of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Previously, he was a product manager at General Assembly, leading the expansion of GA's business programs around the world. He's a New Yorker who's also been selected as an American Express Emerging Innovator. Please welcome my very special guest, Georges Clement.
Hey, Phil, how's it going?
Very excited to have you here. I'm so glad we get to reconnect. Welcome to the show. I'm honored. George and I were lucky enough to meet in Israel the first time around with our Forbes event, and have continued the contact through our private WhatsApp group since then. So I'm so glad we get to have a reason to reconnect and re-engage outside of the typical, meeting. So, and you're calling in from Connecticut right now, but normally you're based out of New York City.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in Connecticut just for the month with some roommates from Boston before moving back to New York full time. But this is probably the longest I've been away from New York City since I was a little kid, and I don't love that. I miss the city a lot.
Well, we'll have to dive into how you got into New York City in the first place, how you fell in love with the city. But before we dive into things, where were you when you first found out you made the Forbes list?
It was morning. I think the list release is early in the morning, and woke up to the email, called my co-founder, called my parents, called a friend who was on his morning commute, and he calls me and is like, "Of course you would call me," and rub this in my face. And I was like, "Wow, how about just congratulations, George? I'm so proud of you."
That's
But
awesome.
no, I was just in my apartment alone, reading emails in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, it's a win for both of you anyway, so that's awesome. I mean, congratulations. And I'm so glad we get to be a part of such a unique community. And before we dive into things, because I know the listeners are going to love this and it could be helpful for so many people. This is a great idea, no-brainer idea. But before we dive into how it works and everything, take us back to the very beginning, George. You know, where you're from, where you grew up, and the path that led you to where you are now, ultimately making it to the Forbes list.
Yeah, so I had a childhood that was basically split between two places. So I grew up in Kansas and a couple of places in Kansas until I was 13 years old. So I lived mostly in Lawrence, Kansas, which is where the University of Kansas is. So this is one of those sort of, blue dots in a sea of red, right? Where you have this sort of progressive little college town. And but in a very rural area, and absolutely loved childhood there. I mean, being a kid, being able to just run around and literally play in cornfields. It's pretty idyllic, right? It's like being Tom Sawyer or something, playing in the creeks and stuff. And then we moved to New York City when I was 13, so between 8th and 9th grade, and I went to I got a scholarship to go to this sort of fancy private school in New York City for high school, and I had actually pushed for this move. So probably around 6th or 7th grade, I started getting a bit of an itch to get out of Kansas, and started telling my parents that I was bored. A big part of it is I have an older brother. My one sibling is an older brother. He's 5 years older than me, and he was a really top level fencer, like a saber fencer, and was traveling all around the world. And I was sitting here
In the middle of
at home.
Kansas.
Yeah, not able to do that travel. In one weekend he's traveling to Spain, and another to Tunisia for these World Cups, and then I was stuck there at home alone, and felt like there was a bigger world I wanted to explore. And so I actually told my parents I was going to figure out a way to send myself to boarding school, and they sort of laughed at me. And I registered for the exam. It's called SSAT, like the entrance exam. Took it. All I did was I asked my parents to drive me there to the testing site. Took the test, did pretty well, and started applying to schools. And my parents realized, like, oh wow, he really can get in. He's really about to send himself away.
Yeah, most parents are the ones that send their kids to boarding school, not the other way around.
Exactly.
And I love how you said you're bored and you're going to go to New York City. Most parents, if they hear their kids bored, they're like, all right, go outside and play, get them a toy or something. This one was like, no, we're going to move to New York City.
Yeah. So my parents, decided let's move with him. We don't want to be away, and truthfully, I didn't want to be away from my parents either. This was gaining leverage in the negotiations with them, and so, they had lived in New York for grad school previously, and so it was familiar to them. My brother was going to be starting at Columbia in the next year, and so it sort of felt like, well, the whole family can be comfortable going there. But I had never lived there before. And so, here I was, a bit of a hick from rural Kansas, moving to the Big Apple, and going to the fancy prep school. And so it was quite a culture shock for me, when you think about how different sides of America can be, the different sides of the educational system as well.
Yeah. I can't imagine. I mean, it's so dichotomous. You're in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and in New York City, there's no going outside and playing in the creek in New York City.
Yeah.
You're going to be playing in the sewer, maybe.
Well, you know what? I got a Metro card when I went there, and in my first week, I remember just feeling like I had never been more independent and more free in my entire life. And this little plastic card to get me anywhere across New York City, and it was a totally liberating experience.
Especially at such a young age. I mean, you're a young teenage in your formative years, and you leave all your friends. I mean, that's got to be a pretty big decision for you to do all that, and traumatic. I mean, how did you manage that shift at such a young age?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think this was right before social media had started also. And so keeping in touch was really like I didn't even have my own cell phone. So it was like, still I was in the mode of, I had to pick up my home phone to catch up with friends. So it was really difficult. And it forced me to make new friends in New York really quickly. I actually saw one of my close friends from childhood for the first time in over a decade a few months ago. And to see the Kansas City Chiefs win the Super Bowl. But it's it's remarkable how easy it is now actually to even go back and keep in touch with folks that were my close friends in elementary and middle school. But of course it was difficult. That age is difficult regardless. But you have such a drive to be independent, and New York City, it felt like I could be totally independent. I didn't have to drive anywhere, like no cars, no fear from my parents of drunk driving in high school, which I think like they were happy about, different kind of concerns though for a rambunctious teenager
on the New York City Metro. Yeah, I mean that's liberating. You had almost too much autonomy. Yeah.
But that transition was such a huge part of shaping who I am. And I really almost instantly fell in love with New York City. And we moved to a neighborhood called Morningside Heights, so sort of the neighborhood between the Upper West Side and West Harlem. So Columbia is around there. And it's a neighborhood that was transitioning a lot while I lived there, and then a lot after I went away to college as well. And it was very literally like the face of the neighborhood changing. And there's a lot of gentrification happening in that area, especially with actually Columbia buying up a lot of buildings. And so the kind of diversity that gave so much community and culture to the neighborhood started to go away, right? And rent prices started to go up, and you started to see folks getting evicted, buildings changing significantly from what were previously older affordable buildings to now like luxury high rises. And it was sort of never something that I was really understanding what that change meant until I came back after college and started to understand what the real process of gentrification looked like and what the harms were, and when that sort of steamroller rolls through a neighborhood, what happens, right? What are all of the
where do those people
consequences
go?
that are felt? Exactly. What are all the consequences that are felt by these longstanding residents in neighborhoods across New York City? So that ended up being, a bit of a part of the motivation behind getting involved and starting JustFix.NYC.
So you're in prep school, you are starting to feel the firsthand experience to gentrification, witnessing it firsthand, and then ultimately are you in college at this point where you ultimately went, because you went to Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, so I went to University of Wisconsin. It's my dad went there as well, actually. Also not a super popular school for people from New York City, but I felt this, sort of you swing from Kansas to New York, and I wanted to go
another
back
big
to,
change.
wanted to go back, I think, to a school that, is in a town a lot like Lawrence, Kansas, actually, right? A sort of college town in a rural area, and had an absolute blast. Really, really enjoyed my 4 years there, and went in studying business, thinking I was going to, I don't know, do finance or something. And after, I think I got a C in accounting and decided this really wasn't for me. I wasn't interested in accounts receivable, and had taken a couple sociology classes and got really close with one professor in particular, and really, really, really loved it. And so ended up majoring in sociology and doing a certificate or minor in African studies and studying abroad in Cape Town, South Africa. And
another huge shift. Wow. Another completely unique culture shock. I'm starting to see a trend here.
Cape Town is one of my favorite, if not my favorite city in the world. So,
it's beautiful. I was just there in December. It's amazing.
Okay. Unbelievable city.
Unbelievable.
Had a really, really fantastic experience there. And, upon graduating, though, with a degree in sociology, you're basically prepared for nothing, right? Unless you want to go to grad school. You're not really prepared for any particular job, right? You're sort of learning like some research and some writing and critical thinking, but all sort of soft skills, nothing with a particular, job or career in mind. And so I was talking with a number of people about, what are different job options, and a number of people just said, look, the tech sector is booming. You should look at joining startups and just see where things go. And you can sort of, try out a lot of different kinds of roles and see what's most interesting to you. And so I actually looked at the most recent class of Y Combinator graduates. And one of them was this company called Tutor Spree, and they were just graduating, still super small, maybe 5 people, and moving back to New York from being in the Bay Area. And given my parents are school teachers, the sort of education angle, it was basically an online tutoring marketplace. The education angle was really of interest to me, and I jumped on board. I was, probably employee 6 or something like that, and was doing sort of anything and everything, right? It could be operations, sales, marketing, customer service,
the normal
whatever
startup
they
role.
needed. Exactly.
You got when you're in a startup, you have to be.
Yeah,
you have to fulfill every role. Whatever it requires, you have to make sure it's happening. They don't care what your title is. You have to do it all.
Exactly. And so I learned so much, and we were all learning together, and they were all around 30 years old, had sort of short careers before this, and this was their first go at entrepreneurship as well. And they were a fantastic group of people working there, all super passionate about the mission, and really, really helpful in terms of helping me learn all of these different aspects of the business. And so I really loved that. And one of the things that I liked the most was also actually collaborating from sort of the business side of things with the CTO, who I was very close with, and thinking about, scoping out new features and that kind of thing. And so I had no idea what that role actually meant, what that job title was or anything, because I had this very sort of general generalist job title as well. And once that company shut down, after just a year, the CEO left to actually become a partner at Y Combinator. I was looking for new jobs and ended up joining General Assembly, where I worked for a couple of years and was a product manager there, working on a variety of different things. And saw that company grow from maybe 70 employees when I joined, 70 to 100, to 450 when I left 2 years later. And it is, it felt a little bit like, being in a movie where you see these companies absolutely explode in a short period of time.
And for those listening that don't know what General Assembly is, it's like a coding boot camp. It's amazing. We actually recruit a lot of our team members out of there. Launch Academy, another one. They're amazing. Even recruiting out of Harvard and MIT, we were finding the tech talent was way higher acumen coming out of these coding boot camps for 3 months than the ones that are, computer science majors at Harvard and MIT. It was amazing. Great idea.
Yeah, it was really, really born out of this idea that there are just so many companies starting that need people with these really practical skills in web development and user experience design and digital marketing. And if you go and get a 4-year marketing degree at a university, you will not learn how to put a Facebook ad live, right? And you think about the marketing spend at companies and what people are actually doing. The majority of it is these kind of 21st century skills, right? That just aren't taught in the traditional institutions. And so,
and you make a great point.
Based on,
and even like the 4 years. I mean, in 4 years, how much changes in 4 years in the tech world. If you're going in learning one thing, getting a marketing degree, by the time you get out, the world's completely different in the marketing world, especially with tech companies. I think this is the future of education, to be honest, is more like tangible, hard skills, back to vocational type learning where you go in for a specific skill set and you come out, you're employable immediately instead of getting like the sociology degree. No offense, you come out. If you don't get an academic, position, you're most likely going to end up at Starbucks trying to pay the bills. And I think that's what's happened a lot with the academic world in the recent years.
Yeah, I mean, it was very much, we were literally talking to companies and saying, what do you need? What are the skill sets that you're hiring for? And then creating curriculum based entirely on what is the day-to-day responsibilities of those roles and matching those things one-to-one. So being able to be completely responsive and super nimble, where curriculum could be changing every 3 months, every 6 months, to be totally responsive. And it's such an incredibly valuable asset. And to your point, people are going into huge amounts of debt for, bachelor and associate's degrees that don't have that kind of
employable
matchup.
nature.
Yeah, employability that you're really looking for when you're making that investment.
I think that's why Google, Facebook, and Tesla, they're no longer requiring degrees to work for them because they're realizing, well, a degree doesn't equate to success. A piece of paper, a diploma. You could have someone that's never been to college and is way more well-equipped to be employed by your company than someone coming out of a 4-year degree.
Not to mention, just what the demographics are of the sort of traditional undergraduate programs, right? And what ethnic and racial backgrounds are underrepresented in the traditional undergraduate programs. And here there's an alternative that is 3 months long with a lot of different scholarship opportunities as well, and direct connections to a lot of employers looking to hire out of those programs like yourself, right? And so it really felt like a part of the future of education that I was actually super excited about, because it wasn't just going straight to MOOCs also, right? And I think the concern I had about that trend at the time was I learned best in person in a classroom with a teacher up front and with peers. And the MOOCs felt to like, maybe it works for a particular kind of person, but it wouldn't have worked for me. And so while that was exploding on one end of the education sector, the in-person version of that type of 21st century skill building was really appealing, and that was General Assembly's focus, was building that out. And so we saw that absolutely explode over the course of a couple of years, and General Assembly's continued to grow since I left. It's now 5 years ago or so.
Yeah, and then how did that lead to where you're at now with your current company?
Yeah, so I apologize. There's some grass cutting happening next door, but I was actually getting a little bit of entrepreneurial itch. So as the company was growing, my role was also shifting from building a lot of new programs to scaling existing programs, and I was really interested in starting something myself. And, I think a lot of people can probably sympathize or it resonates, this idea of like the itch to start something, right? I felt like I had the skill set. I didn't necessarily have the resources, but I had the skill set and I had the drive, and it felt like I was in a place in my life where I could take some risks. And that's totally a mindset of privilege, right? To say, I feel like I can go do something on my own, and I have options to fall back on. And so wanted to take advantage of the fact that I had that sense of security at the time. And I found out about this fellowship program that was being run by the Robin Hood Foundation in New York, which is this very, very large foundation that is the largest anti-poverty foundation in New York City. All of their funding goes to 100 plus nonprofits that serve just New York City low-income residents across a range of different types of programs. So everything from after-school programs, homeless shelters, and more. And they were just starting a program to bring in folks from tech backgrounds to build digital products that would address issues faced by low-income New Yorkers. And so I remember seeing this, and they were looking for web developers, UX designers, and product managers. And I remember seeing this and thinking, like, this is exactly what I want to be doing. It was as if there was a tailor-made program for me that would give some financial support also as I was trying to start something, and match me with an engineer and a designer. So there's so many people with good ideas, and they say the first thing I need is a CTO, and it's like, okay, good luck finding an engineer that just wants to latch on to the idea you just had in the shower. So it felt like really helpful program from the kind of matchmaking perspective as well. And so met my co-founders, Dan Cass and Ashley Trenny, in that program. And, it's also incredibly, a really incredible format to have these three different skill sets and different perspectives on the work from jump, right? Because when you think about, you are starting something and it's typically like a business mindset that's being brought to it potentially. But now instead, we also have the technical and the design mindsets as well. And so met them, and we started doing research on sort of the housing justice ecosystem in New York City. Dan had been doing some volunteer tenant organizing in his neighborhood in Brooklyn, in Crown Heights. And so had a bit of perspective on that aspect of things as well. And it was really about looking at things from a tenant's perspective, and what is the process by which to resolve all kinds of different issues, right? From eviction to needing repairs to getting harassed by your landlord. And we spent a ton of time just doing research, just trying to identify what are the biggest pain points, and is it possible that data, design, technology can be useful in this context.
And so I love this idea. I mean, so many people need it. Let's dive into how it actually works. And when you think of, let's say, so someone's a renter right now and they might get an eviction notice and they're freaking out. You and I spoke about this right before we hit record, but basically they don't know what to do. I mean, they feel like they have to succumb to the landlord's wishes no matter what. They don't have really a say in the matter, and they're fearful. They don't know the technical, they don't have the technical acumen maybe, or the legal acumen to fight this. And so how do you help them do that? Because on your website, you make it so user-friendly and easy and simple and clean. It's like, hey, you got an eviction notice? Click here. You automate a lot of it for them. Can you walk us through, what does a typical scenario look like if you're a renter? So if someone's listening right now, they might be renting their place and have a similar situation they're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the organization and all of the different tools that we built have very much been built with the support of, legal aid attorneys and tenant organizers that have been doing this work for decades. And we're basically trying to help to streamline their workflow and also digitize some of the expertise that they've been bringing to tenants, but isn't available at nearly the scale of the problem, right? When you think about, like, there are hundreds of legal aid housing attorneys in New York City. There are many tenant organizers, but there are 4 million plus renters in New York City, right? So the need is so much bigger than the set of available solutions right now. And so it's really important. Wow, this is a loud lawnmower.
We're not picking it up. It's fine, actually.
Okay. The set of resources is just not all that user-friendly outside of those in-person resources. Right? Those being able to meet with lawyers and organizers. So from a tenant's perspective, repairs and harassment, they would typically call 311 and try to log a complaint with the city. But that oftentimes is like, shouting down a hallway and nobody's there to listen, right? The follow-up is difficult in terms of scheduling an inspection from the city and that kind of thing. So they can come to JustFix.NYC, send a letter of complaint directly to their landlord. They can order some different documentation that's important. So something like their rent history from a state agency. It is really about trying to make a bureaucratic process significantly easier for the tenants. So we guide them through that process step by step with sort of what the best practices are in each of those steps and trying to make it super user friendly. For tenants facing eviction, for instance, we also help them to determine if they're eligible for a free attorney. So New York City has a program called Right to Counsel that actually guarantees legal representation to low-income tenants facing an eviction in New York. And we, in collaboration with Council Coalition, that gives them information about how to access a free attorney if they are eligible. So really trying to streamline the process across these issues.
That's awesome. And what would you say now, knowing what you know now with all the data that you've collected, what's the most common request that you get on your platform?
So there are about 200,000 eviction cases filed in New York City every single year, which is just mind-blowing. When you think about what that actually means on like a family or household basis, right? I mean, literally being forced out of your home, where do you go? In a city with such low vacancy, it's so difficult to go find new affordable housing, right? I mean, you have decades-long waiting lists for real subsidized housing or for public housing in New York. So the alternatives just aren't there for most families. And so that is really what ends up driving the population in shelters increasing, the homeless population increasing, it starts from eviction, right? So there's a huge number of eviction cases. There's also 25% of the city that is living in housing that is what the city itself calls deficient in terms of maintenance conditions. So you're talking about a fifth to a quarter of the renters in New York that have 3 or more maintenance deficiencies at any given time. So that's like rats, cockroaches, lead paint, mold, things that have really serious health implications for families, especially households with young children. You know, these are issues that lead to childhood asthma, which then becomes a lifelong health issue. So these are really, really widespread issues across enormous, you're talking millions of people in New York City alone.
And normally, what do they do? Let's say there is cockroaches or rats. What do they have to call up their landlord, look for the phone number and try to call them up and say, hey, and then it becomes this verbal battle of what do we agree upon? When is it going to be done? How much is it going to cost? Who's paying for it? You kind of simplify that process so it's more automated.
Yeah, you know, you bring up a great point, which is this interpersonal relationship between landlord and tenants. And you know, I think a lot of us have been lucky enough to have good landlords that are responsive and they say, oh, something's broken or there's cockroaches. I'll send over an exterminator. I'll send over a handyman. That gives you this peace of mind. That's like, oh, this is why I'm paying rent and I'm not getting ownership of a building, right? I'm not putting money towards mortgage for a house that I own and maintain, but you're paying rent in exchange for services, the physical shelter, but also the services that include keeping the building up to a minimum standard of care, right, and maintenance. And that just, in the best of cases, is okay. Well, we are both incentive aligned. You want your building to stay in good shape. I want to live in a safe and healthy environment, but there are some business models basically for landlords where they are looking to cut costs as much as they can, or they're actually looking to make the situation so difficult for their tenants that tenants will leave and then they can increase the prices, right? So there's basically particular like rent subsidy programs that create that type of incentive. And then landlords are really just looking at the dollars and cents and saying, well, I don't care if it means this tenant being in unsafe conditions for a period of time, because my goal is just for them to leave as quickly as possible. And so that creates this really, really adverse relationship that can become really toxic. And so when we're looking at the tools that are effective for those tenants, a big piece of it is, how do tenants have the tools to quickly and easily take action in a formal way that's going to have organized documentation, so that if they need to go to the ultimate point of escalation, which is housing court, that they have all of that record that shows that they've taken all of these steps beforehand.
They're taking more of a formal approach, and you simplify that process so they don't have to deal with the landlord directly. They're going through your platform and doing it the formal, legitimate way. So if they do need to back it up with a paper trail, they already have the resources to do that. But let me play devil's advocate here, because you know I own investment properties, and what about from the landlord's point of view? Let's say their mortgage does go up because the property value is going up, and they need to increase the rent price. How can they do that in a way that's not offensive to the tenant? And the reality might be that, yeah, the tenant can no longer afford it and they need to get out and move over. And also, you know, like I can also see from the landlord's point of view, if the tenant is not treating the property properly, it's also hard for them to evict the tenant on it. So how do we make sure that it's fair on both sides? And then the other part of that question is, I lived in East Boston. I lived in Boston the past 3.5 years. And I can tell you, I loved the gentrification process because it actually meant lower crimes. If you know about East Boston, it's very high in gang populations. The gang rates went down, the crime rates went down, the graffiti went down. They opened up a brand new park. It was cleaner. It was beautiful. And I only lived there because literally, I walked to the airport. It was that close, and I traveled so much, so it made sense. But if that gentrification process didn't happen, I could tell you right now, I would have never lived there. So how do we, take the pros and cons of both sides? What do you say to those people that are benefiting from the gentrification process and the reality that, yeah, you can no longer afford this place? It makes me think, and I know I'm going on a little bit longer here, as I want to hear what you have to say, but it makes me think that there should be more of a process on what happens when you do get evicted process, rather than just preventing the eviction from happening. Let's help them. You're going to get evicted. That's the reality of it. If you can no longer afford the property value that has increased now, and the rent's going to increase. So how do we help you make sure you don't end up homeless or you don't end up in a shelter?
Yeah, so great question. I'll take the first one first, which is there's a big difference between market rate housing and subsidized housing, right? So for market rate, we expect that, if the property value in the neighborhood goes up, right, rents will increase, and we know rents could increase, 5% a year or something like that, right? That is rent that is based on market rate, right? Whatever the market dictates, those rents should be. And for folks that can afford to sort of choose any apartment in New York City, right? Go on Street Easy or something and choose any apartment. They're looking at a bunch of apartments that are all market rate, and they're looking at pros and cons of these different options, right? The other piece of this market, though, is subsidized housing, right? And so that is like rent regulated housing, or housing where people are paying part of their rent with vouchers or something, right? But in New York City, you have about 50% of the rental housing stock is rent regulated. And so the regulation basically governs how much rent can increase year to year. And the buildings that that is the case, right? And that increase is typically like no more than 1% a year, 1 or 2% on the high end. That rent and the fact that the rent is capped, there were incentives that were put in place for landlords to agree to having those regulations on all of the apartments in those buildings, right? So they basically got tax incentives most likely at some point in an agreement for the rent increases to be capped year over year for some set period of time, right? Like decades. So there was an agreement that happened that actually created that structure within apartments. And the issue is, for some apartments, landlords had a loophole where they could turn a regulated rent apartment into market rate if they were to vacate the apartment. So that created this incentive for landlords to push people out just by the conditions being so miserable, right? So it's sort of a very particular situation that created those sort of perverse incentives, right? In general, yes, it's totally understandable if landlords, in particular areas want to be increasing rents. It is like dependent on a variety of different factors. But when you're talking about sort of this process sweeping across a neighborhood, for instance, I think the most critical piece is what is happening to the longstanding residents that made that neighborhood what it is, and that have been relying on affordable housing in those neighborhoods for years and years. And where do they go if those areas are then opened up for development, right? And this becomes like a public policy question of zoning, and how do cities zone to make sure that there is enough affordable housing to continue to house the residents that have been living in neighborhoods for a very long time. And so I think, my perspective is more one of, if there are communities dealing with a variety of issues that stem from poverty, how do we actually invest in those communities to make sure that the schools are really good environments for the students, right? That we're investing in small businesses in those neighborhoods that can keep wealth in those neighborhoods and build wealth. And there's a lot that has to happen now, where we are in 2020, to also repair what created a lot of these environments, right? Which was a lot of racist public policy and private sector business practices like redlining, right? That created an environment where there is such stark segregation across so many cities in this country, and where that segregation is not just a racial factor, but also means so much economic disparity between neighborhoods as well, right? I mean, the process of redlining basically meant you had part of the city that could be homeowners and grow their assets through that, and part of the city that weren't able to be homeowners because they couldn't get mortgages. And so they continued to be renters, right? And basically just putting all of their income, throwing it down a drain, right? And not actually putting that income towards building an asset. And so, I think we have to really think about what effects does that have decades down the line, which is, what we're seeing now in terms of the wealth disparity, right? You talked about living in Boston, right? There was this famous study that came out of I think the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston a few years ago. And the average household wealth in Boston of a white family was something like $180,000, and of a black family, $18. That doesn't happen by chance. That's not because some people worked harder, right? That is because there was a system in place that created that on purpose, right? And so we need to think about how does that get remedied, right? Over a longer period of time moving forward. And all of these aspects of housing are deeply connected to all of the questions that we're grappling with in terms of racial justice, right? And there's a lot of advocacy right now talking about housing justice is racial justice because of just how inextricably linked these two issues are.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up. One of our fellow Forbes members, Samir and Abby, created a company called Isusu out of New York City as well. And they help provide credit building opportunities for those that have been maybe from a lower socioeconomic class. And how do they get the mortgage in the first place if their credit's poor? So it helps them kind of transition between that large gap. But that's great. I mean, it's great what you're doing. It's great what they're doing too, to close that gap and let it happen. I could see it from both sides, how some might argue, well, they just need to realize that this is a different, there is systemic injustice and it needs to be changed. In the immediate term, that might not be a solution, but there needs to be maybe work being done from both ends of the candlestick, like the long term and the short immediate term. And it sounds like you're working to help that process. And so if those are listening that are dealing with this situation, they can go to, what can you share the URL so they know where to go to get help just in case they need it?
Yes. So our site is www.JustFix.NYC. We're one of the few companies that took advantage of the .NYC domain, but go there and you can explore a variety of our resources. Some that are for tenants that are needing to take action imminently, and others are more interesting also from sort of a research angle. So we operate a website called Who Owns What, and you can learn all about the history of different buildings in New York and find all of the different data about who owns buildings across New York City as well.
Kind of like a Carfax, you get to see the rental history of the car before you decide to buy it or invest in it. That's smart. And why is it New York City? Are you just in New York City now? What other cities are you in, and what's your plan to expand outside of New York City?
Yeah, so New York City is home for everyone on our team, and that's really where a lot of the sort of passion and original mission came from. But since we got started, so for the past 4 years or so, we've had a lot of interest from cities and states around the country to replicate these services. And just in the past 9 months or so, we've actually started to partner with a group in Los Angeles called Sage on starting to replicate some of these services for tenants in LA. So it's it'll be a long process of sort of expansion and replication, but we're really excited to kick things off with these partners in LA to start.
It's such a no-brainer, and it should be in every city. I can understand why each state has their own regulations that you need to navigate for housing law and whatnot, and policies for tenants. So I can understand. But if you're listening and you want this in your city, you now know where to go to reach out to George. And thinking about your journey, and along the way, you obviously met a lot of people. And I think one of the valuable tips you shared is working in a startup at an early age, so you can learn what it's like to run a startup, work with a team, the dynamics, and what's required of you to start your own before you actually go out and take the risk. So 2 questions. One, what do you think was the single most important attribute that got you to the success that you have now? And then also, who were those pivotal people early on with you that have gotten you to where you are today? Because we never do this journey alone.
Well, at the risk of being a total cliche, it's definitely learning from my parents. So when I was 4 years old, my brother was 9. We were living in Lawrence, Kansas, and my parents weren't super happy with sort of the school option in town. And so they were educators, and they decided, well, why can't we just start a school and have our boys attend our school? And so they rented what was previously a frat house. So this enormous house in Old West Lawrence, and they started a school. There were maybe 15 to 20 kids that came to my house every day.
Wow.
So the basement and the backyard and the first floor were a school. We're Meadowlark Elementary School, and then our family lived on the top floors. And it meant every morning I would wake up, walk downstairs, eat a bowl of Cheerios during French class to start the day. But I think the takeaway, as amazing as of an experience as it was, the takeaway was very much my parents saw this problem, and instead of just sort of wallowing in the fact that there weren't the kind of resources or opportunities that they were hoping for their kids, they decided just to do something about it and proactively work on a solution. And so I never thought of it this way until recently, actually. But my parents were entrepreneurs, right? And I was seeing them start this school out of my house. And, they did it for a few years. It's a struggle, right? To start a small business, especially start a school in a town that, is not used to sort of alternatives to traditional public school. And there were, 20 kids that came to my house every day for this amazing educational experience. And I so super, super valued that experience always, but I never thought of my parents as entrepreneurs until very recently. But I think it shaped so much of the sort of personality and drive in my brother and I to up until now, where It really just feels like if there's a problem that we identify that we really want to solve, just go solve it.
I love that. That's the entrepreneurial mindset. Imagine if every kid was taught that in their early childhood education, just thinking about problem solving rather than asking other people to fix the problem for you. It's like the employee mindset versus the founder entrepreneurial mindset. Versus, either asks people to fix it for you or fix it yourself if the problem's not getting solved. I love that. So you answered both those questions in one. I love it. And thinking about this hustle as you started turning your idea into a real full-fledged startup, what's something scrappy you did to hustle that maybe you couldn't have revealed in the very beginning, but you're willing to share now that you're further along?
So, we've definitely talked about this with folks since then. So I don't know how much of a secret it is, but when we were first researching this issue area and we were really trying to understand what the experience was like for a tenant, we went to housing court, and we had heard these really scary things about housing court, because you can imagine it's sort of like traffic court if you've ever been to traffic court. But instead of it being just like $100 ticket that's up for debate, it's literally people losing their homes, right? But it is that kind of a packed, high volume court experience. And so we went, and for weeks, we just sat in the back of courtrooms, just observing what was going on to see
That's genius.
What was this experience like for tenants. And there were a number of times where sort of toward the end of the day, there were not as many people in the courtroom. A lot of cases had been heard, and we were still sitting back there, and the judge would say, "Hey, you in the back, what are you doing here? Do you have a case?" "No." "Okay, well, why are you here?" "Well, I'm sort of just curious what it's like." "Okay, no one comes to housing court voluntarily. This is not a place you want to be." I was like, yeah, but, sort of doing some research to see if there's, this or that thing we can develop, and ended up developing relationships with some of the judges, some of the court staff and attorneys that were there. But more importantly, was able to understand what an average day in the court looked like. And, it's hard to develop true empathy without going through the process yourself, right? And
I can imagine
really had to,
being like a Jerry Springer TV show. I mean, it's got to be very traumatic. People are emotional. They're on the verge of losing their home. Their family's going to be displaced. They might have children. They're crying. I mean, I can't imagine what that must have been like. You guys might have needed therapy after each session, just as like a debrief, seeing this. I mean, it's incredible. What a great idea. And you probably had so much information that you could write down of like, okay, of the 10 cases we've seen, it seems like this one continues to come up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, super, super rich opportunity to learn about the process, and gained so many insights from just observing. And it's where we, connected with lawyers and tenants that we started working with from the very beginning. Super helpful in the process of developing the organization. And I think just a really critical piece for anybody who's trying to start a new company or organization is how do you get as close to the problem as possible, and not just ask people questions, but actually observe what is happening in reality.
I love it. That's a great tip.
Super critical part of sort of user research.
As we conclude, we're going to transition into something I call the under 30 seconds round. I'm going to fire off some quick questions, answer with the first thing that comes to mind. You ready?
Okay.
All right. What is the book you've gifted more often than any other book, and why?
So the thing that actually comes to mind is Derek and Beto, who two of our friends and fellow list makers were in Boston actually recently with me, and I recommended a book to them both by one of my professors from the Kennedy School, this guy Marshall Gans, who wrote a book that's called Why David Sometimes Wins. And it's looking at the California farm worker movement and basically the power of community organizing to make change.
Good one. What's one of the best investments and one of the worst investments you've ever made, and why?
So there's definitely recency bias in this, but bought a pair of clippers to keep myself in reasonable order during quarantine, as I haven't been able to see a barber in quite a long time. So that's helped, I think, keep me sane and keep me a bit presentable during this crazy time. I was trying to do sort of stand-up desk at some point in quarantine, and bought something that ended up collapsing within the first 2 days of having it. So almost broke my computer, and was no longer a good substitute for the stack of books that I was using to use as a stand-up desk. So my takeaway is keep it simple.
Stay away from the stand-up desk. What's the most impactful thing you do in your morning routine and the most impactful thing you do in your evening routine?
I think it's tough to even call it a morning routine. I'm so not a morning person. It's really like the morning struggle of waking up and rolling out of bed. I do need an iced coffee in the morning, and you know, I know you're like all about the life hacks and healthy lifestyle, but like an iced coffee and a bagel and cream cheese in the morning is what gets me going.
That's the New Yorker in you.
And in the
iced
evening,
coffee
I would say,
and bagel is so New York.
That's right. And then evening, I would say try to have like a family style dinner with my roommates or family as much as possible. You know, I think there was a period where I was living, breathing, sleeping, work, and it's too much, and you know, you forget to spend time with the people you love, and so big family style dinners,
I love that.
I think are super, super critical.
I went through that phase as well when I was building my ed tech company. And I remember I used to tell my friends, I hope one day we'll just be able to take a pill and that will serve as our meal and provide all the nutrients we need. And they used to joke, because they'd be like, Phil, we're just going to put an eye slot in your door for your bedroom and we'll just slide the food through to you because you never leave your work environment. And now I'm realizing there's so much more than just providing you the nutrients. It's the social gathering, the emotional health that you gain from these around, the tables around food. And there's actually, my dad recently passed away, and one of the organizations that helps those that have lost loved ones is called, I think, the dinnertable.org. And it's all about a monthly dinner table, meeting, so you can share your stories and whatnot. And by the way, another thing I just thought of is that life hack that we were talking about. They did a study on coffee and found that people that drank cold coffee versus warm coffee, it was the only variable changed in their experiment. They found that when given the same exact scene or story, they resonated more with positive energy, uplifting energy, like happiness, when they held warm coffee, and they were more cold, closed, and unhappy when they had the cold coffee. So ever since I learned that, I try to stay away from the iced coffee as much as possible.
No, but it's so good.
Maybe I'll be the reason that you switch. But all right, second to last one. Pretend you won the Peter Thiel Fellowship and you're going to get money to start a business instead of go to college. What's the very first thing you do to start your new business?
I don't know I would ever forego college. It was so important and so fun. I feel like I learned so just so much. But I would say, like, where my mind is really at right now is what are companies that can help address the racial wealth gap. And I think that there are we need nonprofit models, for-profit models. We need public policy to all be addressing those issues. And so I think there are definitely some real business opportunities there as well. But it's part of a much larger pie of solutions that we need.
There you go. And what's something you never knew you needed?
Something I never knew I needed. I got a new phone case recently, and I was typically someone who never ever had it, and I would break my phone all the time, and I was just super duper stubborn, and finally feel like I can toss it around, and I'm not going to need to replace my phone every year now.
Yeah,
very boring.
You were one of
I do.
You were one of those people that goes around with this glass iPhone, and it's like $1,000 phone, and you're just not worried at all. I never understood the barbaric savagery you guys had. But welcome to the phone case club. And now the thing I always mention that I never knew I needed was this pop socket. My buddy in Boston recommended, he's like, Phil, just try it out for a week. If you don't like it, take it off. I have no idea how I ever lived without the pop socket on the back of the case. It's a game changer. Once you use it, you're never going to go back.
Okay. Well, I might have to try that out now. It's baby steps. I'm very stubborn.
Yeah. Well, George, thank you so much for being here today. Before you go, what's next for you? Next big goal, milestone, or bucket list item you want to achieve?
Yeah, we were talking about this a little bit beforehand. I'm helping a friend who is starting a company called Enrich that is working to place really high-performing Black and Latinx recent college graduates into jobs in the top firms in the country. And so really excited to help with that, and hope that we can make a dent.
Please reach out if you're looking to hire and want to diversify your candidate pipeline. It's enrichscholars.com for that program, by the way, enrichscholars.com. And we'll put it in the show notes. Where do listeners go to connect with you directly?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, Furious George, with an S on the end. So Furious Georges. At JustFix.NYC on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever you might be, whatever social media platforms you might be on.
There you go. We'll put those in the show notes as well. Great. Go connect with George. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today. This is George with JustFix.NYC, who provides help for those that are renting. We learned so much today. We learned to make sure you get a phone case. We learned how you could go from rural Kansas to New York City and fall in love with it. We even learned how to start your day with a bagel and iced coffee. George, thank you so much for being here today. Such a pleasure. A lot of fun.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
I hope this episode helped you as much as it helped me. Have an amazing day.
Thanks for joining us today. I hope this episode helped you as much as it helped me. Who do you think would benefit from hearing it? You can make an impact on their life by sharing it now. Before you go, I encourage you to tell us your favorite part of the episode in the review section. Now it's time to level up. Level up.